everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Philanthropy's Role Supporting Civic Engagement. We'll begin in just a minute, but I want to give you some reminders before we get started. First, for any technical issues, please submit a message to the hosts and panelists through the chat or email us at govt@cof.org. We will be happy to help you. For automated live transcript, click at the bottom of your screen to show subtitles or view full transcript. This webinar is being recorded and we'll share it with all participants alongside any resources shared throughout our event. Finally, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. We'll have some time for them at the end, and the Q&A box is also at the bottom of your screen. At this time, I'm happy to hand it over to Anita Banerjee, Senior Director of Strategy and External Relations at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation.
Thank you so much, Nadal. And I am so happy to be in community with everyone for the next hour. As Nadal mentioned, I'm with the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. We are happy to be a co-sponsor of today's event to really dig into the need for philanthropy to step up in this moment in amidst a very important election year. So as many of you know, we are still building out what our lives look like post-COVID, right? And life to life is looking different from whether you're in rural America, suburban America, or urban America. And then when you parse that out even more geographically, the divide looks so very different. But given that, we know how very important it is for nonprofit engagement, for nonprofits to be well-resourced and to have strong coordinated efforts so that they can be those trusted messengers to help, whether it is assisting folks to get registered to vote, it's giving them, the information they need to make educated decisions at the polls, or it's sharing about what mis and disinformation may look like. So given that, philanthropy's role is even more important in these times when we are grappling with so many societal issues. I don't think I need to tell you that we are grappling with many, whether it's reproductive justice, or it's climate change, or it's the economy, or inequitable access to broadband. We are really amidst trying times, wanting to make sure that families feel safe, secure, and have the resources they need, but at the same time, making sure that they are executing their right to vote. And so philanthropy has this important, critical, consistent opportunity to step up and provide opportunity for nonprofits to be those support systems. So recognizing that we have a great panel with us today to dig into a little bit more about philanthropy's role in civic engagement, I would like to turn to our esteemed panelists. First up will be Brian Miller from Nonprofit Vote, and he will give us an opportunity to dive in a little bit more into what this kind of engagement could look like. So I will now turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you both to the Council on Foundations and FCCP for putting this webinar together. I think it's a really important discussion. I'm going to go ahead and kick up a slide here, make sure I can share this correctly. So again, I am here because we partnered with the Council on Foundations, United Philanthropy Forum, and Independent Sector to put together an initiative we call Philanthropy for Voter Engagement. Let me get to my other screen here. There we go. I'm going to bottom, and well, again, I'm with Nonprofit Vote. We're basically a resource organization. We provide training and support to nonprofits across the country to help them build out voter engagement initiatives. We partnered with, again, these organizations, Council on Foundations, United Philanthropy Forum, et cetera, for the Philanthropy for Voter Engagement Initiative, which is what I'm really here to talk about today. And so, what animates our work as an organization, and I'm sure what animates a lot of the folks here in this room, is how we close gaps in voter participation, right? Gaps drawn along the lines of race, income, age, that distort our democracy. They diminish the influence of our nonprofits that are working in these communities, trying to advance our respective missions and goals. But then how do we close them? And election policy is part of it, but it's only a small part of it. And we know this because we see these gaps are still present in even the most voter-friendly states, that there's something else driving these gaps. And unfortunately, political campaigns and candidates actually exacerbate and deepen these gaps. And they're not being spiteful. It's just their purpose is not to foster an inclusive electorate. Their purpose is to win an election. And so when a campaign or candidate's out there getting folks registered, getting them to the polls, they're focusing on likely voters. Again, they're trying to win an election. So campaigns focus on likely voters, which means they're not contacting people who don't have a history of voting. Not being contacted, these communities don't vote. They're labeled once again as an unlikely voter. And this cycle keeps repeating itself. And if we're ever going to get to an inclusive democracy or something that's more representative of the broad electorate, we need a different set of economics driving this. And that's really where nonprofits and the philanthropies that support them come in. For starters, nonprofits, because they're nonpartisan, they're not focused on what happens in November. What they are focused on are the people who come to my nonprofit agency, do they have a seat at the table? Do they have a say in the policies that influence their lives? Voting is an important part of that, and it has nothing to do with the previous voting history. They want their community to be represented. These nonprofits also have long-term roots. They have cultural competency, trust, and they're really well suited to do this voter engagement work. And our data shows that it works. If you look at last year, we did an analysis. Well, earlier this year, we released this analysis called Nonprofit Power, which analyzed a number of voters who were engaged at nonprofits, food pantries, health clinics, et cetera, across 8 states. The first finding wasn't too shocking, that voters engaged by nonprofits were 2.5 times as likely to be low income. They were more likely to be voters of color and or younger voters. The second data point is really the compelling one, because the people who were engaged by nonprofits voted at rates 10 percentage points higher than comparable voters in the same community. And that percentage point boost goes up even more for younger voters, low-income voters, and others who are otherwise represented. Then you're talking 14, 15 percentage point boost. So we know nonprofits are incredibly effective at doing this work. It's in their mission to make sure their communities are doing it. However, somewhat less than 20% of nonprofits are actually doing this. And fewer still foundations are directly supporting that work. And that's really what we're trying to change with the Philanthropy for Voter Engagement initiative. And so over the course of the last year, we interviewed about 30 or so foundations to identify best practices, some of the strategies folks are using. We also put together a host of resources, templates, legal guidelines, and case studies that are part of this toolkit. You can scan this code to get to it. I think they'll also be put in the chat box. But just to give you a sampling of what's in there, the first real finding or common strategy that we find here is really funding early and consistently. Of course, Democracy Fund they're in the wrapping up, I suppose, the All In by April initiative, which was really focused on getting foundations to give their grants early in the year, not too late in the cycle. That's really critically important, in addition to giving consistently year over year, including so-called off years. The second real finding is thinking expansively, and this is really important because not every foundation is ready to start giving grants for voter engagement work. And you don't even have to be a democracy funder. Maybe you could provide supplemental grants. Maybe you're a housing or healthcare funder, and you're just providing supplemental funding for health centers to do voter engagement work with the clients that come to their doors. But you could also host trainings for your grantees. A lot of community foundations are directly partnering with their grantees and hosting candidate forums. Other foundations are leveraging their communications channels. There's a lot of ways you can send signals to your grantees in the network that this is important work to do. The third real thing is, of course, learning the rules and knowing what you can and can't do. I'm not going to get into that because Rami is going to cover that quite well, I'm sure. But we do have a legal guide in the toolkit that goes over some of the basics. We also find a lot of foundations are hiring out of the voter engagement space. So when they're looking for a program officer to run the voter engagement work, they sometimes hire out of that space, that they have folks who are rooted in that, who know the space and know what works. And another recommendation is really revisiting grant language. I've seen the worst of the ones I've seen are ones that say, you cannot do, quote, political activity, but that's a very vague and unclear term, because is nonpartisan voter registration political? I don't know, maybe. The IRS does not prohibit, quote, political activity, they prohibit partisan political activity, which means you can't endorse or oppose a candidate. And so really getting clear about the language that you're using. Again, as I noted earlier, we have a host of case studies in here. We've added a few more since then, including Jefferson Regional Foundation, and glad to have Danny here with us today to talk about the work they're doing at Jefferson Votes. Again, as I said, we have legal guides that cover staying nonpartisan, voter registration, ballot measures, but Ramey's going to get into that, so I will forego those slides and just end with this. You can get the toolkit. It's a microsite, philanthropy.nonprofitvote.org. You can also scan there. And again, it's got everything from case studies to best practices to toolkits, resource guides, and legal guidelines. And with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Anita. And thank you again for having us as part of this conversation. It's really important. And Anita.
Thank you so much, Brian, and we look forward to engaging with you during our panel discussion when we engage with all of the panelists together. So segueing now to one of the case studies that Brian mentioned, I'd like to turn it over to Danny Verub from the Jefferson Regional Foundation. Danny, can you share with us a little bit more about the case study? How did the Jefferson Regional Foundation get involved with this, and what were some of the results?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks to Anita, and thanks for the Council on Foundations for having me as a speaker today. As Anita mentioned, my name is Danny Verub. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Community Engagement Manager with Jefferson Regional Foundation. I thought a little background on the work of the foundation will be helpful prior to discussing our nonpartisan voter engagement work. So the Jefferson Regional Foundation is really a place-based foundation supporting health and well-being in the communities south of Pittsburgh within Allegheny County. We have 3 prongs to the work that we do: engagement, community-driven research, and grant making. Now, as Community Engagement Manager, I oversee the Jefferson Community Collaborative, which is an initiative and an investment of the Jefferson Regional Foundation. It is made up of 100+ community serving organizations that support health and well-being in this area. And we convene throughout the year to network, to share powerful ideas, and to build on capacity. So as Anita was asking, why nonpartisan voter engagement? Well, nonprofit partners of the collaborative recognize the need to really mobilize community residents in nonpartisan civic engagement activities. This really continues on the work that we did around the 2020 census. The objective of this nonpartisan voter engagement initiative, which we call Jefferson Votes, is really to leverage local nonprofit partners as trusted entities within our communities to help increase voter engagement and participation, to inform residents within the community about the importance of voting, and then to increase civic engagement in our communities. Nonprofit organizations that participated in one or more activities related to nonpartisan voter engagement were called voter engagement champions. So how did Jefferson Regional Foundation support nonprofit partners? Well, we had 3 prongs to our approach to the work. And this work was discussed and reviewed with our nonprofit partners. They all had a say in what the work was and what the end result would really be with that. We had our first item that we provided to our partners was a series of web pages that we put on our website. We called it really a one-stop shop for information about voting in Pennsylvania. So on there, you would find everything from how to register to vote, sample ballots, how to find your polling places. And the second piece that we provided our partners was a toolkit of resources. And much like Brian mentioned, these were easily downloadable and usable pieces for our partners, such as election guides showing polling locations and role of elected officials. We had pledge cards, posters that individuals were able to put around their organization or pass out at their organization to their constituents, sample internal and external emails, as well as social media content for Facebook, Twitter, at the time, now X, and Instagram, for organizations just to be able to pull and utilize on their own social media pages. And finally, the third piece was we provided workshops for nonprofit organizations. So first of being the do's and don'ts around nonpartisan voter engagement work and why nonprofit organizations should be doing that work. We had another on voting accessibility as well as disinformation in voting. So in addition to the web pages, the toolkit and the trainings, the foundation also provided mini grants to assist organizations with costs associated with nonpartisan voter engagement, education, and outreach. That was a lot. So I want to get into what the results were. So I talked earlier about voter engagement champions participating in one or more action leading up to the November 2022 election. We had 47 organizations sign up to become voter engagement champions. We had 13 organizations participate in our mini grants for a total of $13,000 applied to them for additional support in nonpartisan voter engagement. We specifically targeted organizations in our communities with a high rate of lapsed voters, which was an important focus for us because studies have shown it's easier to get lapsed voters to come back to the voting booth. Almost 40% of our participating organizations were from areas with a high rate of lapsed voters. And finally, although I can't really attribute this statistic directly to our work, voting rates increased in all of the communities within our footprint at the November 2022 election.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'm looking forward to digging in a little bit deeper with you. And I love the term voter engagement champions. I want to use that one here in Illinois.
You can be our 48th voter engagement champion.
So now moving into the law, we've got with us our third panelist, Ramy Barnwell from the Council on Foundations. And Ramy, we want to dig in about, what is it that foundations can do legally when it comes to civic engagement and voter participation? Is there a different rule for the private foundations? And then finally, what safeguards exist to protect foundations from electioneering?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anita. As Anita shared, my name is Ramy Barnwell, staff counsel at the Council on Foundations. And before we dive into answering these questions, I want to give a brief disclaimer that this presentation isn't intended to provide legal, tax, or financial advice. I am not creating an attorney-client relationship with anybody in this call. And certainly if you have really specific questions about really discrete situations, we advise you to seek the advice of your own legal counsel. So that first question, what can foundations do when it comes to civic engagement and voter participation? I think it's really important to understand the background and the foundation under which being able to participate in civic engagement sort of arises. So any organization that's tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code cannot participate in, intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. And that includes federally, state campaigns, local campaigns. I think it's also really important to note that favor or opposition of political candidates, it's explicit and implicit activity. So what you're saying is just as important as what you're not saying. If you think that you're giving a wink, wink, nod, nod, that's a symbol to take your foot off the gas and really consider what's happening. Really, there's a lot of activities that foundations can do when it comes to civic engagement and voter participation. And I like to put them into two buckets, two categories. The first would be education-related activity. So any nonpartisan public education or training sessions, that is permissible. And I think it's important to note that nonpartisan is not the same as bipartisan, and I will say that time and time again. Foundations can also educate candidates on public interest issues or publish a voting guide on broad issues that don't reflect any sort of bias. And I think it's helpful to note that we know what foundations can engage in because particular organizations have sought revenue rulings from the IRS. So if your organization, your foundation has a specific question, hey, can we do this? And it's something that's not on either of these lists, then I definitely suggest seeking a revenue ruling so that you can get that very clear advice, that very clear permission to engage in those activities. Foundations can also participate in events. You can host candidate debates or forums. You can invite candidates to speak at an event, but it's really important that you give all candidates equal opportunity to speak at the event. Any candidate that's seeking office, they need to be offered the same invitation, the same amount of time to speak, and that there's no political fundraising at that event. Finally, in terms of events, foundations can have nonpartisan get out the vote and voter registration drives. And that's specifically going to be for public charities. We will, in a moment, turn to what public charities can do versus private foundations. But again, before we move on to that, I want to emphasize nonpartisan and bipartisan are not the same. And when you think about bipartisan, if you're hosting 3 different events for 3 different political parties, that is not the same as hosting an event that does not identify, support, oppose any political party. You really want to make sure that it's a nonpartisan event. So turning to the question of public charities versus private foundations, we looked a little bit at what public charities can do, especially those get out the vote and voter registration drives. Ideally, those will take place for more than one election cycle, and private foundations can participate, especially in the realm of funding those events, but it's really important that they follow certain guidelines. So under section 4945F of the Internal Revenue Code, to avoid getting a penalty tax, an excise tax, it's important that private foundations make sure that any event that they're funding is hosted by a 501c3 organization, that the activities are nonpartisan. Again, I said I'm going to keep saying that, I really will, are nonpartisan and conducted in 5 or more states and occurs over more than one election cycle. It's also important that the contribution doesn't require use in a specific state or a specific election cycle. And at least 85% of the sponsoring organization's income is directly spent on activities related to the purpose that sponsoring organization is organized and operated for. I know those were a lot of words at one time. So really, when you think about the sponsoring organization, that's going to be the public charity that's hosting this voter registration drive. You want to make sure that 85% of the income of that public charity is spent on activities related to the purpose that that public charity was granted its tax exemption, which is really a way of saying, you want to be sure that this public charity, if it is organized to advance education in this public education in the state of Montana, that they're spending 85% of their income on supporting public education in the state of Montana rather than any other purpose. And then finally, at least 85% of that sponsoring organization support should be contributed by exempt organizations, the general public or government units, and no more than 25% of that sponsoring organization's support can come from any one exempt organization. Finally, no more than 50% of its support can come from any gross investment income. So private foundations do have a little bit more to overcome, more rules to follow when it comes to supporting voter-related activities or voter drives. But as long as you follow these guidelines, which again can be found in section 4945F of the Internal Revenue Code, then your private foundation is on the right road to make sure it's in compliance with the law. So Anita's final question was around safeguards that exist to prevent foundations from electioneering, which is a really important question. The Johnson Amendment, which is named such because it was sponsored by then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who, as we know, went on to become president, and it regulates what nonprofits can do in the political arena. Specifically, it prohibits nonprofits from directly or indirectly participating in a political campaign, intervening in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elected public office. So out of the Johnson Amendment, we got a really clear idea of what foundations cannot do. So I've listed just a few prohibited activities for foundations. So foundations certainly cannot endorse candidates for public office under any circumstance, make any sort of campaign contribution, make a positive or critical reference to someone in their capacity or status as a candidate. They can't engage in issue advocacy when the organization can't articulate a clear, neutral, non-electoral purpose for the activity or communication. They also cannot increase the volume or amount of criticism of sitting officials who are also candidates as election time approaches. They can't highlight the differences between candidates for public office on a high-profile issue on which the candidates have diverging views. You might ask yourself, what is a high-profile issue? Probably whatever issue came to mind first is going to count as a high-profile issue. And they certainly can't ask candidates to sign pledges on any issue. I didn't read all of the prohibited activities on this slide, but I trust that you can look over these, review them to know what foundations can't engage in.
Thank you so much, Rami. That was a lot of great compacted information, and I'm sure folks will want to dig into that deeper when they have a chance. So now, getting into a conversation with all of us panelists, if I could have all three of you come on screen. First question I will pose to all of you and ask you to jump in as you see fit. So what does all this mean from a legal perspective, a practitioner point of view, and foundation standpoint for November, right, for 2024, and then beyond? What does it mean for long-term civic engagement? Philanthropy's role. Don't all jump in at once.
I was just thinking about, like, you know, obviously we want to see, and I think there is, Democracy Fund just came out with another report. I think it came out yesterday or today, talking about the growth in foundations that are supporting this work, that more and more foundations are moving into the democracy space, partially because there's a recognition of the importance of this work. And it's not, I mean, we've seen it over the last several years, you know, how are we going to get to that inclusive democracy goal that we all are striving for? I think for the work of nonprofit vote, and I think some of the issues is folks are trying to navigate it, because now it's getting to be where more and more funders in it, there's a lot of questions, you know, trying to avoid redundancies, where folks are leaning into voter election policies versus voter engagement work, and they all have an important role, and we need to make sure that we're looking at the totality of the system. And so I think I would argue groups like FCCP, which are providing that analysis framework of, you know, and others at PACE and others that are really looking at how does all this fit together, I think is a question. As more funders move into this space, that question is going to get reshuffled a little bit. For our work, we're really looking at how do funders work to support the organizations that are already in their grantee network. Again, we work with groups like Kansas Health Foundation, which we profiled the last time we did this, and they were looking at the connections between health outcomes and democracy. And so they built out voter engagement programs that encouraged health centers to start building out voter engagement and provide additional funding for a lot of the civic deserts and health centers in their respective communities to do this work.
Wonderful, Brian. Can I ask Rami to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really, really important to think about the legal frameworks that exist and sort of what it looks like. But I think at the end of the day, voter engagement ideally looks like a landscape where everyone's voice is heard. What we really want is to maximize access so that it is more equal across the board. And I think that really what we want to make sure that we do while we're maximizing that access is staying within the framework the IRS has provided.
If I can jump into, I think for us at Jefferson Regional Foundation, timeliness is of utmost importance, and our civic and policy engagement action team, which really has advised this work, is really dedicated right now to making sure that the materials that we produced for the 2020 election cycle are updated and ready to share with the people in their community and their constituents now. So timeliness is huge for us, and was a big response that we got for the 2022 election. Give us this information a little bit earlier.
So building off of that, the timing is important. Brian, question for you is, we understand that there are these case studies that have come out with philanthropy engaging to help build stronger communities. But what does voter engagement actually look like across the country, right? Like we talked about, what works in Kentucky may not work in Kansas, may not work in New York, right? But we recognize that everybody's still, kind of fighting this voter engagement apathy. And so why, what does that look like? One, and then two, why does it matter so much right now? Like, why is this important?
I think how it looks, I would argue I'm simplifying here a little bit, but that there's two sort of different strategies by which nonprofits are doing the voter engagement work, right? A lot of the groups that we work with, we work to support a lot of human service nonprofits and others, where they're really looking at their clients and the communities that they serve. So what they're doing often is what we call reverse door knocking. They're not out there knocking on neighborhoods or out at bus stops. They're basically getting the clients who are coming into the health center's doors already and making sure that they're engaged. And so they're building voter engagement into client intake programs. They're putting voter engagement tables out in the lobby, which, again, can include everything from voter registration to voter education, helping voters navigate how to do voter engagement work. A lot of nonprofits we work with that are doing like citizenship work and helping working with immigrant communities. They're doing voter registration drives at swearing-in ceremonies, right? Where you've got a lot of this stuff. And so I think one model of the voter engagement is really leaning into.
Oops. It looks like we may have lost Brian there for a moment.
We'll never know. Leaning into.
There he is.
I'm back. I don't know how much I lost there. I was speaking of the two models. Are we still on my question or did we move on?
No, we're still waiting for you.
Okay, sorry about that. So I think one model is really nonprofits that are looking at the people who are coming to the door. The other way, and this is a very different way in which the voter engagement work, is really folks who are looking at geographic areas or communities. They're maybe targeting a civic desert and places where there's whole communities where voting rates are just abysmally low. And in that case, you really are looking at, folks who may be doing voter file, they're, identifying geographic areas and going out into the community in more of an outreach standpoint. Both of those models are important. And I think both of them can be effective at targeting underrepresented voters and bringing them into the process, because that's our ultimate goal. And I think the one thing that I would circle back to, and I think circling back to that feedback loop I talked about earlier, where I showed the negative feedback loop, there is also a positive feedback loop, which is that as underrepresented voters start voting, as communities start voting, campaigns start making contact, campaigns start asking, hey, what are the issues that are important to you? As those campaigns are asking those questions, the communities feel a sense of, hey, maybe our vote does matter, maybe our opinion does matter in voting. And that's the habit forming nature of voting. Because once you're labeled as a likely voter in the voter file campaign, you're going to start getting the mailbox full of letters. You're going to start getting the phone calls. And so part of the habit forming nature of voting is really breaking that feedback loop and really churning that positive feedback loop. And that's our hope, is what we can have more and more as we break and move towards that more inclusive democracy.
So reiterate for us why this moment is so important.
Well, I think I would argue this moment is important. Yes, we're obviously coming up to 2024, but the way I view this is that it's a chance to get people's attention. I think the work needs to go on way beyond 2024. And I think everyone on this call would agree. This is not something we're just doing in 2024, packing up our bags and going home. But can we use 2024 as a chance to get a lot of folks' attention, to get folks moving into this space who maybe might not have been investing in this or might not have been thinking much about it? Yes, but my hope is what happens is we make that into a long-term habit of those organizations.
Hear, hear. So Danny, expounding on that, we know that the Jefferson Regional Foundation got involved in 2022, and you've got this great case study. But now, as we are looking ahead to the general 2024 elections and beyond, what does this mean for your foundation? How were you able to get the buy-in from your board to get more engaged, and how do you look to continue to do work in this space?
Sure, thanks, Anita. So the mission of the foundation is to support health and well-being in the areas south of Pittsburgh, and we do that through engagement, research, and grant making. As a result of the work that the foundation did around the census, they really saw the community and nonprofit partners galvanize around this work. Listening to community and community voice is most important in all the work that we've done with the foundation. So as a result, our board understands that a community that participates in civic engagement is a healthy community, which goes back to really our mission of supporting health and well-being within our communities. But for the board, we really outlined the impact cycle of nonpartisan voter engagement, which I believe Brian touched on a little bit earlier. So nonprofits supporting nonpartisan voter engagements, and then nonprofits embedding this nonpartisan practice into the services that they provide. Brian was talking about having voter registration as part of forms. So encouraging organizations to do that. And then the result of that being the turnout increases because nonprofits are a trusted entity within our communities. And then really the result of that is that we have better leaders in place to support the needs of our community members. And the work that we've done with Jefferson Votes has really expanded our civic and policy engagement action team. We're looking right now at having organizations advocate for themselves and for their constituents. This work, again, is all done through the input of nonprofit partners, what would be best for them, what would be most supportive for them, and then to be able to relate to their constituents. But talking about engagement, we produced a one-pager document on why organizations should advocate for themselves and had a panel discussion for local advocates to share that kind of how they're doing this work. And this all culminated into a legislative breakfast that we had at the beginning of the year. So really kind of putting all of these pieces together for our nonprofit organizations that we support to have a better understanding of this kind of cyclical piece of advocacy and civic engagement.
That's wonderful. So as I mentioned at the top of the call, state to state, we are all still building out from, the COVID-19 crisis. And so state legislatures are also very invested with the societal issues of our time and also looking at democracy from the societal lenses, I should say. So Rami, question for you. how has state legislation across the country since 2020 changed the voter engagement landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have seen a number of states introduce legislation around state election administration. Georgia is one state in particular that has passed a great deal of changes to state election administration. And there are other states that have, like I mentioned, introduced legislation. So I think it's really important to stay in the know, sort of informed about what the current state legislation looks like wherever you are.
So one more question for the panelists before we move into Q&A. Are there any particular resources? Like, we've given a lot of information. Rami, I know you've cited some the IRS code and others, but are there particular resources, other resources that you believe are important for philanthropy to be aware of as they're thinking about what their role should be for the general and beyond?
I am going to give the really stereotypical lawyer answer that I think a really important resource to start with and to come back to is the Internal Revenue Code, just as a base jumping off point for any voter engagement for nonprofits. And I think that it's important to remember that the law is a floor, not a ceiling.
Very good advice. Brian or Danny, any resources you want to lift up?
So one of the things that our nonprofit partners were very interested in was not reinventing the wheel, knowing that so many resources are out there and they're out there to be utilized. So in that way, we were able to frame our work and be able to pull resources from nonprofit votes. Shout out to Brian. And the League of Women Voters to really inform the work that we did, putting together our own toolkit, putting together our web pages, and thinking about what would be most helpful for our nonprofit partners to get them excited and engaged in doing this work.
And just to jump in, I would add, obviously to talk about the Philanthropy for Voter Engagement Toolkit that we lifted up earlier on this thing is a great resource. And in the back of it, we also have links to a lot of other resources. Again, within the toolkit, we have the case studies. We've got a lot of strategies and best practices. We do have a legal set of legal guidelines. But in the back, we also provide links to FCCP. We provide links to PACE, as well as the Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy, which has some really good resources for how private, and I saw a lot of questions in the chat window about it was clearly going to this 5-state rule and how that works, and we will circle back, but that is addressed in the Boulder Advocacy fact sheet, which we lean into as well as nonprofit votes. So there are resources in there. Again, it's in the back of our Philanthropy for Voter Engagement Toolkit. There's a link for additional resources that we would certainly recommend foundations go to, as Rami says, know the rules. And just to speak really quickly to that 5-state rule, there are organizations like us, because we're a national organization. We have a pre-approval, I don't know what you actually call it, a letter from the IRS that says we meet 4945F standards, which means a private foundation can give us money for voter registration. But we have to constantly be alert that no one sends us a grant earmarked for voter registration in a particular state. Otherwise, that letter's null and void. And so I think there's efforts we make as a nationwide group to ensure that we stay compliant with 4945F, which is the IRS rule that Rami was referencing. Community foundations can absolutely give money for voter registration in a particular state as long as it's nonpartisan. Private foundations can give money for voter engagement, voter education, or general support work in one state. It's just that earmarked, and I'm sure Rami can elaborate on that. But those are the resources that we would lift up. Is again, the Philanthropy for Voter Engagement Toolkit is a starting point, but from there you can branch off to some of these other groups.
Thank you for that, Brian. I also want to second the Boulder advocacy piece. They've got some incredible resources, and I know that if you were to reach out and you wanted a specific training, I think that they would be willing to provide one as well. But so now let's jump into some of the audience questions. I know we had a lot of questions percolating around Rami's presentation. And so audience question, can you discuss more about the state requirements for private foundations? What happens if a state-based foundation only works in one state? Can that place-based foundation provide general operating support grants to support local nonprofits working on nonpartisan civic engagement?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's helpful to clarify, and I want to clarify now that if a private foundation provides a general operating support grant to a public charity, the rules of 4945F do not apply. And this is an instance where, because it would be a general support grant, 4945F doesn't come into question.
So next question. Why are we seeing foundations pulling back their support of nonpartisan civic engagement and voter participation work? Brian, is this one you could address?
I don't have a prepared, I don't have an answer for that. And I'm not sure if, yeah, I guess the statistics, I need to read the Democracy Fund thing that just came out today, because they were arguing the opposite, that more funders are moving into the space, but maybe it's more funders moving into a different element of the space. And I don't know how that deck is getting shuffled, if more money is going into voting rights work or advocacy work and less into voter engagement. I don't have enough information to know where the shortfalls are coming and what's real and what's perceived as far as changes in voter engagement funding. I wish I did know, but I don't. We go out there and we ask as much and often as we can.
Understood. I can say little minimally from the FCCP convening that we had earlier this year, that there is in fact a hunger from a lot of foundations to participate. But when you've got specific, giving areas, and you've got a very specific timeline that you're following, it is hard to build in extra unless you're thinking about, really building out or having a strategic plan that can then build in more of the voter engagement. And so our hope is in the larger funder spectrum that people do start to think about the consistent funding, as Brian mentioned earlier, this becoming a more evergreen environment, right? It's necessary to start building in those off election years to ensure that you've got the resources that are necessary for groups on the ground to be able to activate, to be able to educate, to be able to train folks so that you're at the ready when the time comes. So next audience question. We've seen some questions about more case studies. Where can folks find additional examples of foundations doing this work? I know we can find that in the Philanthropy voter engagement toolkit, but are there other places? Danny, do you have somewhere on your website, or do you have a video or anything that you can share in addition for folks to be able to dive in?
So on the Jefferson Community Collaborative website, we do have the web pages, the toolkit, and recordings of some of the pieces that we did for Jefferson folks. Some of those materials do need to be updated, but they are live on there.
Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I was trying to find it on our website, and it's really it's a little older, but we did do a version of this toolkit back in 2018 that highlighted a different set of foundations. Actually, I guess we released it in 19, but it was based on interviews we did in 18. I'll try to find that and throw it in there, and it'll give you a mix of other foundations and how they rolled out again, this work.
Wonderful. And if I can mention just really quickly, we know that New York is doing some really great work in this space in a collaborative manner. There is an initiative called Go Vote New York City, where there are some statewide funders, national funders, and local funders all coming together and looking at the work that needs to be done in New York City to protect people's right to vote, and ensure that people are well informed to be registered to vote so that they can actually go to the polls. There is another group, I believe it's called Engage New York. While they are doing work for separate communities and regionally across New York, they're also looking at a spectrum of democracy issues. And so just wanted to lift that up, and that there are other ways in which people are looking at doing this work more collaboratively, but not necessarily in case study format just yet. So next question, and this might be a little bit of an esoteric question, but I'm going to pose it to Rami to see if she'll be able to help us parse it down. Do revenue rulings from the IRS create binding precedent?
Yeah, those are my favorite kind of questions. They're really esoteric, like let's get into the details. So revenue rulings do not create legally binding precedent. So they're not binding, but they are incredibly persuasive because they give us the IRS's official interpretation of an issue. So it's sort of a peek into the brain, into the inner workings of the IRS and how they view a particular issue or question.
Thank you for that. I wish we could have you on speed dial for all the questions that we have that come up in the legal space. So now I want to go into a question that I think a lot of foundations grapple with and want to make sure that they're staying on the up and up and that there's, no cause for concern. But question to all three of you: how do we frame voter engagement in a way that avoids politicization?
I'll take a stab at that, and then happy to, I think what we do at Nonprofit Vote and the work we do is really leaning into a core set of values. And those values aren't about, blue wave, red wave, or anything like that. It's about our democracy works better when more people participate and vote, period. And we anchor everything in a universal value framework that our democracy is going to work better when more people participate and vote. Now, to get there, we need to target outreach efforts to groups that are currently underrepresented, right? And so how do we bring underrepresented people to the polls? This is about, do the people we serve as a nonprofit, do they have a voice in what matters? And that's the kind of language that we regularly anchor our work in, because it's really about equity. It's not about politics. It's not about again, partisanship. It's about equity, about core values of equity and inclusivity. That's the kind of democracy we want to build. So that's, I think, a language thing that we certainly use in our work. I think the second thing that we do, and this is what we do partially as Nonprofit Vote, but also through our management of National Voter Registration Day, is really lean into some mainstream partners with a lot of nonpartisan cred. We work with, we're working with YMCA to build out voter engagement programs, United Ways, groups like that. We're not talking, these are fairly straightforward organizations that have a broad amount of respect. And as they build out voter engagement programs, they can say, this is democracies for everyone. And I think we do the same thing with the National Voter Registration Day work, which we manage. And so we're able to lean into a lot of, we have corporate partners. We've got everyone from Target and Levi signing on to support this, just as well as the National Association of Realtors are helping jointly rally and support this National Voter Registration Day thing. Because we need to, I would argue, we as citizens need to reclaim the democracy from the partisans and put forth that core value that we all have a role. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Neither is it something that we should concede to the partisans. We hold that core value. Democracy is for everyone.
So in that vein, Danny, do you have anything you'd want to add to this?
I think it's paramount to the work that we did was the idea that the nonprofit organizations that are serving the community that we serve are trusted entities within the community. So the people within our service area go to those organizations, they trust those organizations, and they understand that the information that they will be providing them is for educational purposes and to promote this idea of civic engagement.
And Rami, from the legal perspective, do you have anything to add that would quell some of the concerns for folks that are looking to engage in the foundation philanthropy space?
Yeah, I think for me, I would go to the preamble of our Constitution that the goal is to have a more perfect union. And the only way to get closer to that more perfect union is to have more voices be heard. What we want is participation. And I don't think that anybody would disagree about that.
Indeed. So I know that we've got just about 5 minutes left into our 60-minute community conversation, and want to thank the panelists for their great contributions today. But if I could do a round robin and go around and ask each of you, if you could give some advice to foundations that are emerging in this space, what would it be?
Jump first. Unless somebody, I'm glad to yield the floor, but I think one of the things that we talk about, one of the questions we ask the funders that are moving into this space is what got you into this space? Thinking about where's the strategic alignment, where's the mission alignment, right? Because if it's going to have a staying power and lasting power within your foundation, it needs to be anchored to your mission. It needs to be anchored to your strategies. And so I think it's taken the time to think about where it connects. It's not something we're doing just because it's 2024 and oh my God. It's something we're doing because we as a healthcare foundation see the connections between health outcomes and civic engagement. It's that we as an organization that's helping ex-felons re-enter society understand that as people vote, it actually has positive impacts on the way they engage in society and reduces return recidivism. It has broader impacts. It's thinking about the ways in which democracy and voting ties to what we're funding as a foundation. For an education funder, and connecting those dots, because that's how you're going to make it stick. If you're a health, yeah. I think that's what I would say. Connected to the mission, connected to the strategy. The rest of it is how you implement it. But I think you start by really thinking long and hard about how this connects with the foundation's mission and strategy.
Brian, I think that's a huge point. I would say have a RAMI, know what you can and cannot do as a nonprofit. Get buy-in from your board and really make the connection as we try to do as a foundation with health and well-being and the importance of civic engagement. Seek the feedback of community, listen to community voice in the nonprofits and what they need and what would be most helpful for them. And then utilize the resources that are currently available. And I would say, start now.
And I would say, really simply, have the law be your North Star.
Short and sweet, love it. So I want to take a moment to thank you, Rami, Danny, and Brian for joining us today. An important conversation that we need to keep lifting up in our philanthropic communities, recognizing that we would like to strengthen our freedoms to vote. We want to ensure that every person has the voice in our democracy and uses it. And so can't express enough how important this is. Wanted to give a huge thank you to Council on Foundations, to the Jefferson Regional Foundation, especially to Nonprofit Vote, for participating in today's joint conversation. Want to just really quickly note for advocacy purposes, as folks are delving into the civic engagement, voter engagement space, there are, as you look to engage in this work and beyond, there will be educational briefings and awareness building around the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Just for your knowledge, wanted to share that with you as we move closer to the general elections. If anyone has any questions for the for any of our panelists, feel free to please reach out to Council on Foundations. And thank you so very much for your time today.